Welcome everyone to this program titled How We See, Rindon Johnson and the Question of One's Vision, which consists of a talk by Dr. Ramon Amaro, who will also be in conversation with artist Rindon Johnson about his exhibition, Best Synthetic Answer, currently on view at the Rockbound Art Museum in Shanghai. My name is Joanie Zhu, Head of Programs and Research at the Rockbound Art Museum, and with very great pleasure, I welcome and introduce Rindon Johnson and this exhibition. Rindon Johnson is an artist and poet. Moving between physical and virtual spaces, Rindon's multidisciplinary practice is grounded in language, in its multiplicities, its failures, its contradictions, and its systemic powers. His work uses this grounding to examine how the effects of capitalism, climate, and technology construct our realities. At times, Rindon focuses on specific words, latching onto words that mark change or differences such as byproduct, five, and trans. He used these linguistic studies to move both towards and away from abstraction simultaneously. The exhibition Best Synthetic Answer emerged from a series of discussions between Rindon and the museum's director and chief curator, Xu Noel, and navigates the complex geographies of the Pacific, interrogating traditional notions of borders, fixed territory, states, and ecocide. The Pacific is full of commerce. Its floor is divided up for mining, freight lanes, and crisscross its expanse, and commercial fishing extends across it. To maintain the current level of exploitation of the Earth's resources, the Pacific is crucial to securing a capitalistic future. Through the exhibition, Rindon asks, how does a Black American raised on the edge of the Pacific move through the ocean to reach Shanghai? Apart from obvious forms of resource extraction as forms of exploitation, on what levels am I also responsible for this destruction? As a consuming human on this earth, as an American citizen, as a Black person, as my parents' only son, what seismic shifts will come from the collapse of ecosystems? Besides, ultimately, what does anyone gain from exploitation at this magnitude? How do I witness this ocean's past, present, and future? How do I attempt to atone for the United States' historical, current, and impending destruction and exploitation of the Pacific Ocean and the people who call it home? How to name all of that? How to swim through it? How big is the Pacific Ocean, really? Nothing is so big it cannot be measured, right? At the heart of the exhibition is a newly commissioned video installation, Best Synthetic Answer #1, Crossing, 2024, that simulates a real-time journey from Rindon's birthplace on the unceded territories of the Ohlone people in San Francisco to Shanghai. Spanning 7 months, Rindon's avatar, the main character of the work, swims in real time across Pacific Ocean, offering an immersive yet temporally and widely experience that attempts and ultimately fails to describe the immensity and multidimensionality of the Pacific, specifically by following the wake of the United States' destructive interventions. Rindon wonders what can bring us together and what pull us apart. His combinations of word, technology, and object creates multi-layered works. His forms of expression range from publishing and virtual reality to leather, wood, and stone. Rindon has also presented solo exhibitions throughout Europe and United States, most recently SEC's Strombeek in Grimbergen, Albertinium in Dresden, Chisenhall Gallery in London, and Sculpture Centre in Long Island City. Rindon has recently participated in the 60th Venice Biennale, and he is also the author of The Law of Large Numbers, Black Sonic Abyss, and Ever Given, both published by Impatient in 2021 and 2022, among many other books. And with this, I also welcome Dr. Ramon Amaro. Dr. Ramon Amaro is a senior researcher for digital culture and lead curator at -1, a testing ground for new tools, methods, and public uses of digital culture at Newer Institute in Rotterdam. His writings, research, and artistic practice emerge at the intersection of Black study, digital culture, psychosocial study, and the critique of computational reason. Ramon holds a BSc in mechanical engineering, an MA in sociology, and a PhD in philosophy of technology. Before joining Newer Institute, Ramon worked as an assistant professor in art and visual cultures of the Global South at UCL in London, lecturer in visual cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London, engineering program manager at the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and quality design engineer in General Motors Corporation. His recent book, The Black Technical Object, on Machine Learning and the Aspiration of Black Being, published by Sternberg in 2023, contemplates the abstruse nature of programming and mathematics and the deep incursion of racial hierarchy to inspire alternative approaches to contemporary algorithmic practice. So Ramon will start with a provocation, and I will leave and hand over to Ramon, who can call upon Rindon for a conversation. Over to you, Ramon.
Thank you, Shani, and thank you to all of the staff and teams at Grokman for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with Rindon today. This isn't I guess I'm going to start here. In issue of being transparent, this isn't the first time that Rindon and I have been in conversation, or that I've engaged with Rindon's work. So part of what I wanted to do was think about, what would be a different way to engage with Rindon, because, not everyone has seen the previous time we were together or may have experienced that. And this is also a particularly different moment, especially for Rindon, when I think about, the canon of your work and the trajectory of your work and how the stickiness of the type of problems in which you're negotiating with. And it seems that the more complex your work gets, the more nuanced it gets, the more situated it gets, it seems to produce more questions than answers. And so with these questions, I thought to myself, with the complication of this, I cannot come into this intervention with Rindon and talk about the same things. Even researching you and about your work for this, there are recurrent themes that come up in conversations that you have. And most of them center around language. And you flip the page, you click a new link, it's language. What we discussed last time to catch everyone up was language. You see, a video clip of you, it's language. You read the documentation to your work, it's language. And I found it almost impossible to even escape the issue of language itself. And so I said to myself, what do I even discuss with Rindon? Is there anything outside of language? And if I can discuss anything outside of language, what would that actually even look like? So is Rindon actually proposing that we're encased, almost suffocated by this idea of language, that there's so much so that there's no escape, there's nothing more to talk about than being in that space? And if this is the case, then even in its most generative positive sense, what's the consequence of this? So that was almost like a statement question. So I want to question on you.
I sometimes think that might be true, that we're encased and suffocating inside of language. At the same time, I feel totally I feel completely in a sort of feedback loop with Audre Lorde, the master's tools, the master's house. It's is language, whose tool is language in this circumstance, right? And I feel like for this exhibition, I was very interested in what Imrivar was talking about in his book, How to Hide an Empire, about the virality of the English language and the fact that because the way that the British were able to colonize wasn't just through their violent actions, but it was also through the colonization of the mind, through the language. And as someone who's a native English speaker, I also am thinking everything is within this context of a language that I don't necessarily know has my best interest at heart. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, so I don't know. I think that's yeah. Basically, language is the wall that I keep hitting up against. But at the same time, it's also malleable and it's also open in a way. Like we can change it. And the issue is that we have to agree to change it somehow. And sometimes that agreement isn't even spoken. It just happens. So I guess I'm still totally perplexed by it. But the thing that I can't figure out, and I was hoping you could help me figure out, is what's up with data in relation to these things, right? Like a data point is like it is fixed in one moment and then it's easily transferable into something else in the next. And so it's like if we look at like the back end of this piece that's up right now, of the crossing, like the crossing is basically just a series of data points that are constantly being updated and then it's spitting itself out over and over again. But we could switch those data points and the ocean would look a lot different, but it would still be just a number from 1 to 9. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I don't know. I'm confused too.
Yeah, I think this, that moment that you're speaking of, maybe I can go first and then come back. Um, One of the things was sort of sticking in my mind is this conversation that you're having, even with Audre Lorde and thinking about this, master slave scenario. First, I'm gonna sort of maybe ask that. I'm not sure if everyone would even be familiar what that argument is or what that scope or what Lord is sort of referring to. So maybe, when I bounce it back, we can elaborate on that. But to transfer it now into thinking about, data's relationship, for me, it's also a very complicated question because I think like what appears on the surface, it seems quite simple. You have data being these fragments of information, fragments of, utterances, pieces, all these sort of, little bits of our culture and experiences and even our words and thoughts and ideas sort of just given away in a very fragmented sense. But it's only when it's put together does it become information, right? So in a way, the data is language, but it really doesn't become language. If we were to consider language in a traditional colonial sense, which is a very linear, hard structure, right, that is supposed to communicate something. But if we consider it that way, then data itself is just sort of building blocks to a type of language. But it sounds like you're thinking about ways in which we can break out of that paradigm as well. Like, but actually in that scope, are you suggesting that it's something we could break out of that paradigm, or is it something that you're almost suggesting we work through? Like, do we build new blocks, sort of like Lego blocks, and put them in new directions, change the shape of them and reform them, and then maybe the previous language becomes incomprehensible? Or is your thought that maybe perhaps we need to have a new concept of communication and relation?
I think if you had asked me a few months ago, it would have been the former.
Mm,
That we it's almost like our duty to participate in especially these like technological leaps and advances to like really work through what AI can do and what it means to have a large language model, like all of these things, and then find on the other side of that working like new possibility, hopefully with by using abstraction. um, but I think I'm beginning to think that it actually the way forward is actually by trying to premisize perception writ large, like perception as a total experience, and perception as like specifically individual and thus impossible to be considered universal. And in that specificity, then is the liberation, if that makes sense. And by staying hyper specific, we might then be able to sort out all the multiplicitous problems that are kind of um, weighing down our various societies as they try and interact with one another. And that specificity then is like also about locality and all of these things. And yeah, I don't know. I'm also starting to realize that within these technologies is like are hints at things that we just will never be able to describe. Like for
Like what?
example, like I don't know how to say this without sounding corny, but like in like the reason why all my works are self-generating instead of like first rendered out is because the computer can't like render out are the things that our vision believes is true. It can only like very quickly spit it out and then our eyes will do the adjusting, right? And so what I'm kind of curious about in that is like our eyes doing all that extra labor is something very particular and very human, something that the computer doesn't have the capacity yet to do. And in the work that I made for Chisenhale, the first time that we had a conversation, I was really trying to focus on this idea of like a specific place and the fact that the specific place was only possible, like we could only really see it by looking at it for the same amount of time that I was interested that was there, right? But this piece is totally different in that it's completely speculative. It's like never has any reality except that we can see it, right? And so it's like by us seeing it, it becomes real. And so what I'm trying to say, and I hope this is making sense, is that our at the edges of our perception is the thing that the computer can't do. And at the edges of our perception might be where we can find um, liberation outside of the traditional forms that we're used to seeing. And so, for example, when we look in a really dark space in the digital space, our eye fills in what should be there. And it's up to the animator to give the eye enough so that it can fill in the rest. And it's the same on the white end of the spectrum, right? And so I guess I'm kind of like, if my works exist in a place where they're only very, like, barely visible, like, very barely legible in that way, then maybe they also are existing on that very outside of language, like on the thing that you can't fully even name. And then that goes back into like black abstraction and questions around like what is memory and how do we construct memory and all of these things. And so, yeah, so I don't know. I think it's all intertwined in that, but I'm totally confused by it. Like,
I mean, I wonder how much also how much of this, confusion is this idea that, this conflation right now that we experience between fiction and reality. I think it's something that, the last few decades we started off with this very, fearful lens of this kind of virtual, something that's sort of this extra meta real that sort of represent us. And, the sci-fi has been, sort of spearheading this for, decades and decades before that. But I see, but as time goes on, we see this sort of conflation now between, what is speculative and what's real. Like what is future, what's present, like what is fantasy, what's more pragmatic and practical. And it's very interesting to me that, you're also talking about like, how, large language models, and I think you're saying, these even these sort of data models and these very highly sophisticated generative computational models, um, they're also occupying other spaces, political spaces, the spaces of rhetoric, the spaces of possibility. And we see this in the current political situations in many places around the world where, um, where occupation actually becomes the generative part of language. We've gone through waves of human history where the political landscape, it required obscurity, or even the social landscape, let's, for safety reasons, let's be as obscure as possible. There was a type of opacity, and of course that gave way to, a type of transparency where everything, we want things accessible to be clear and democratized and whatever meaning of that word, right? As many people as possible to understand one type of concept, in that sense, and we see in this contemporary moment, and perhaps this is the way that technology actually is now aligning itself with different types of social processes, where now we're saying that, the occupation of language going into sort of the more ephemeral, so in sort of fear-based rhetorics and rhetorics of division, or rhetorics that emphasize other, cultural stereotypes or other types of mechanisms. And it becomes very difficult to now tell, what's fiction and what's reality, because it all becomes speculative, because fear itself is speculative. And in a way, it's for a species that depends so much on language. It seems that we become more and more disconnected from language itself, at least language in the present reality, I should say. It
Yeah.
seems like we've just given over language of the present reality at this point to sort of a future type of scope. And now it feels like we're battling for who gets to occupy that space.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I I think part of why that battle feels so intense is that the second that something is named, it's easy to be owned. And since neoliberal capitalism has such a stranglehold on so many places, that basically means the second it's named, it can then be commodified. But what about things that, when named, still can't be commodified? And I feel like that's the space of the duration, like of having something that lasts so long you can't see it. That feels like a space of like, okay, you can't commodify this, you can't hold on to it, you can't try and own it. And I don't know, I'm also thinking about like the filibuster, like in American politics. Like the fact that it's like, no, we're just gonna keep going until we get what we want.
Exhaustion,
um
right?
Exhaustion, and it's like exhaustion as power is also kind of
Mm,
fascinating.
mm,
Like, and also exhaustion that leads to uprising is also an interesting thing.
yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I also am thinking too a lot about the ideas of like, is it the lines between fiction and reality? It's like, is it that we're imagining a reality, that we've imagined a reality that is subpar for many people, and thus we are enacting it? Or is it that one person or a grouping of people have said the best way for my reality to be good is to create a group of subpar humans, and thus I will make that imagination understood by many and will enact it all together, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that idea. I think that that last point, I think, is that, that idea of what that type of democratization of language means.
Yeah.
Not necessarily the process of democratization, but the actual attempt at it, and how, and I guess what I'm thinking about listening to you speak on this is sort of, also this search for this moment of comprehension,
Yeah.
and how that's connected to exhaustion and frustration. It's one thing to be exhausted and have a direct causality. Like, I've done fitness for 8 hours today. I'm, exhausted. Or I've played my favorite video game for four. I was supposed to turn it off an hour ago, but it's been 8 hours and I'm exhausted. Or I'm in the park and I'm straining. I'm walking. I'm exhausted. But there's something else when that exhaustion becomes something that's like unseen, untouched, unheld. It can only be experienced, and in many cases is so incompatible with how we should be living naturally.
Mm.
But but when I look at your work, so if I could be provocative for a moment here, though, I mean, literally as we speak, okay, as we speak right now, it may not be you in the ocean, but a representative of you, of your being. Because let's be honest, even though your avatar is AI powered, even though it's going to, sites of disposition at the hands historically of the United States, even though it's making this trajectory that's there, in one sense, it could seem to be just an algorithm, just an avatar, just a machine that's there. But it also represents you in your life. When we're talking about the human and the machine and, data in, data out, we're used to talking about things that are deficits to humanity. But in this sense, you have kind of offered part of yourself over to this technology. And in a way, the technology is almost exhausting itself on your behalf, right? It's swimming right now. It's been on a long journey. And if I have it correctly, your avatar has not stopped swimming for months, right? Even the weather. So it's almost like this naturalization of exhaustion, like in almost a degenerative sense, like the weather just exhausts the sea, and then the sea in return exhausts the weather, and then that exhausts the land, and now you have your avatar just joining that milieu.
Yeah.
And I'm almost wondering, like, is that the threshold where you kind of reach that maximum, not in a bad way maximum, but that maximum threshold that says maybe you have to be exhausted in relation to something in order to be something new?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think like, yeah, I think that's it, basically. Like,
If it were only that simple, right?
it's, I mean, like in a lot of ways, yeah. I think also it's like the journey is the process. It's like the act of the attempt is also is the work in that way. And so it like very literally is that in this scenario, but I also kind of feel that generally. So yeah, so it's like a acting out of those questions. I don't know, it's like I've been thinking a lot about my avatar in relation to myself because it is so me and it looks like me and all of these, it's very recognizably myself, but it's also stronger than I'll ever be. It's also a much like it's a weirder swimmer. My swimming technique is much better. You know what I mean? Like it's just a little off, but I also, I don't know. I think in the same way that like I started the swim in one position in my life and I like the swim will end in a totally different other position, I also feel that or so like I feel the the weather on the avatar also weathering its way through my own life and that feels odd. I don't know how to deal with that. And what that means, like the natural temporalities of change, or is it something bigger, like something larger as I swim? I'm not sure. I also think the act of like I think the fact that the avatar is always refreshing is something that I'm very curious about. The fact that the avatar, and this was like a kind of, it wasn't like a fight that we had, but it was like my developers and I were just like, should I fall apart or not? And I think this question of like falling apart or not, I was like, at first I'd been like, oh, would it be kind of cool? Like a skeleton at the end? That's kind of cool. But this idea that like I'm always the same felt actually more palpable and intense. Like it felt somehow more realistic. Like the fact that to the to the generated to the onlooker, the the avatar can never change or something, you know? It's the
Right,
onlooker that changes.
right, right. I mean, it feels like this is, I know a lot of what you're concerned with is, space and time in this relationship, right? And
Mm.
not just, our human bodies and material types of things on the, in this world, but also, your own growth and your own transformation, like not just your work itself, but, your actual body and your actual being, and what that might mean. Um, and I think in relationship to things, our own sort of personal transformations, it's based on a lot of assumptions, right? Like you're saying, like these are very static things. And I feel like the things that you're really bringing forward, and I think it's very generous of you in this sense, right? Because in a way, I feel like a lot of your work is this sort of very textual, material way for us to understand this tension that we all have in the world, and how that's related to the stasis or transformation, or should we stay the same? Should we change? And I think that's where I'm going
Yeah,
very clumsily, even with the language of politics right now. Should we go back? Should we go forward? Should we stay the same? Should we change? Like we're so stuck in this moment, and it's so turbulent.
yeah,
And then here you are with a digital representation of yourself, literally a code that is supposed to represent you, and it has the exact same tension. And that to me is, is really fascinating, in this type of sense. And I'm curious in this sense, then if you've even thought about like then what happens next? Like what are you hoping to arrive at? I know your avatar is on the way to Shanghai,
Yeah.
right? But I'm curious, where are you trying to arrive at?
I am not sure. I guess if I knew, I wouldn't be going. I think I was just the other day reading Blockchain Chicken Farm by Xiaowei Wang, and at some point Wang is like, listen, the thing that makes us human is our commitments. And our commitment to make a commitment means that you're cool with not knowing what the outcome is. And they were talking about it in relation to like a farmer who is just like, well, I'm farming this season, and if I get crops, I get crops, and if I don't, fuck it. And I think that I don't know. I think the best way I can answer that is like I'm really committed to making art. That's what I got. I'm like really committed to it. I don't really understand what's going to happen. I'm
Right,
completely confused by all of it. I know that somewhere in these large like swaths of data that I'm collecting and playing around with is something, but I do not know. And I think like I made this piece also because I was like, I don't know. I don't know why it is that why it would be important for me to go and follow this route of American imperialism. But I also know that if I don't go, I'll miss something, if that makes sense. And I'm already inherently missing something. Like I didn't move to Shanghai for 7 months. You know what I mean? So I'm not there every day seeing it, but just the act of acting it out is also something too. So I don't know. I think I'm kind of, I think all I can, what I'm looking for is the thing that I cannot name and I do not know.
right,
And that
right,
kind of desperate hunt, I think, is likely going to preoccupy me for the rest of my life.
right.
But I also think I can smell it, if that makes sense.
Getting close, getting close.
Yeah, like
I,
I'm hitting somewhere.
yeah, I mean, I don't know how many people are going to watch this. I hope tons of people do watch this, but I feel like you were able to in just a few seconds give the most lucid explanation of the effects of capitalism or the effects of of sort of economic domination or all those types of processes. The idea that perhaps a more beneficial or pure sense, with whatever you could call pure, more, I would just say more authentic sense of being, like if you're a farmer and you have a harvest and you're already in negotiation, it's already ecologically inclusive, right? Because you're in relationship with the soil and the wind and the rain and the seasons and the moon and the sun, all those sort of things. And at the end of that entire cycle, the result could be one carrot or it could be a million.
Yeah.
The carrots could have two stalks or 15 or none. You have zero idea what might happen, and your only recourse is to just accept that that relationship itself is okay, and you just begin again and
Yeah.
start again. And but when I think about the intersection of capitalism, how it disrupts that process is all of a sudden you wake up with the sunrise and you say, okay, sun, I'm going to respond to you. Okay, I'm going to go to the soil. I'm going to be in conversation. Here's what I can control, giving you more water. Here's what I can't control, what you might produce. Capitalism comes in and demands an explanation for each one of those stages
Yeah.
and it demands productivity from each one of those phases. So much so that they're willing to cut out pieces of it
Yeah.
in order to facilitate that process. I mean, you have entire companies that are designed now around misused vegetables, right? Because they don't look appropriate, right? These are orphan vegetables, right? And it's really interesting to sort of think about how something so complex can also be quite simple.
Mm, yeah.
Searching for something I can't find, or finding something I didn't know I was searching for.
Totally. Totally.
And and I now have this relationship with so many things, so many materials in which you can begin to answer that question is what I find interesting. And even from a curatorial perspective, I think it's quite fascinating. I feel like this is like a 10 in 1 bonus, your entire show, right? Because you can find this moment of seeking on a screen-based work. You can then find this moment of seeking in your own time in the ocean with the avatar. As far as I know, there's currently a cowhide having a relationship with the building and the sun right now, right?
Yeah.
And to think about how many opportunities you're sort of giving to open this conversation. So I guess the question in that would be, is that the hope? Is that these different textures will create different entry points into this problem? Or is it you experimenting with different ways to speak this language? Or is it a combination of both?
Hmm. I kind of feel like, okay, I I wish that it was as intentional as like these are all different entry points. But because this is like also just my practice, it's also just kind of like this is the various stuff that I've been throwing at the wall for years to try and work through these questions. And I wonder if they function, you know? This show is the biggest show I've ever done, and it has also inside of it like the largest articulations of some work that I've been thinking through for so long. So in that way, it's like, yeah, maybe like it's cool that it all fits together. But in a way, I have like a very almost naive, just like, could we do that? Is that possible? Is that like, can we try it? And the fact that it reads like that is also just like it feels like a manifestation or something of like the faith that I have in the idea or something, like to then suddenly see, like, for example, the mirror work, like that's outside, like I never made a work of that scale before. And I've had the idea kicking around and I've played around with it, but it's never played itself out like this, you know? And it's like the cowhide that's on the roof, it's like that piece was like, oh yeah, I've kind of like hinted at that, but never like the full cow, never like through a typhoon, never like in this way. And so in some ways I'm kind of like, it's really lucky it works. Oh, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the RAM team was very much just like, it works, Ram. It'll be okay. And I
It'll
think
be okay.
it'll be okay. It works. And I think yeah, I think I'm kind of each, what almost happens is like each work and each idea is almost exists so that the other ones can exist too. Like I could never just make a digital piece. I could never just make a stained glass work. It's like without the other, it doesn't feel complete or something. And that was a question that I had early on is was like, is this show one piece or is it multiple pieces? That was like a hard question that I couldn't answer.
Right, right. I
Yeah.
mean, it would make sense that that would also be the tension, right? If
Yeah.
because what I hear is reassurance, right? And how one piece might reassure another
Yeah,
in different
exactly.
ways, or and be in relationship, with each other. And I think that's such a beautiful illustration, even of us as human beings, right?
Mm.
Of what it means for two individual beings or more to occupy, this sort of skin sack that we have, to occupy this space and express ourselves in different ways, but also have to be together.
Mm.
What happens in an understanding that we might not know the result, that we might not know what happens.
Yeah.
But for me, this brings me back sort of full circle, I think,
Mm.
because historically there are some relationships where you know what's going to happen, or
Yeah.
that organize the future where what's going to happen can be easily predicted because these relationships never really reconcile to work themselves out.
Mm.
What it means to be an historically marginalized person, or what we call minority community, or even majority communities. We're talking about the master slave dynamic, right? Um, like it doesn't just actually fall in one community. It's in all communities, no matter how large and how complex that are there. And the complications that we experience today, and even thinking about how we might have a future at the same time protect and nurture and reassure that those beautiful things that make us us, because they're not always compatible, unfortunately, I think.
Unfortunately. Like, but I feel like maybe they could be.
But they
And
could be.
they
Yeah.
could like, and I don't know. I'm also like, what does that world look like?
Right.
How does it feel to be in that space?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's
Do you think that's the closer promise to the world of the avatar, this verse, this plural meta for, this whole virtual verse? I mean, that was the initial promise, right? Is that
yeah,
we could occupy and be. Do you think we've like, is this where we should go then? Should we just keep going?
I don't know. I don't know. I think like it's like inherent in this space is already we've dragged all the issues with our current reality into this space. Like, I couldn't make my swimmer. I had to ask my wife, who's white passing, to do it because there was no off-the-shelf technology that could see me swim, right? And so it's like I couldn't even imagine myself doing it because the computer can't imagine myself doing it. And so it's like, okay, cool. It's kind of like
Yeah,
that's fun
yeah,
information. And then at the same time, it's also like, well, if I still have to like do all these workarounds to exist in this space, then it's not maybe in this space. But this space does have the potential to show me things quickly. Like it can show me realities that I haven't thought of before that are based on other realities, other images that we've made before, like other ideas of what is the blue of the ocean, so on and so forth. But it could be a kind of intermediary step to something else. Like, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about, like, because I have a 7-year old, and they have a lot of obsessions now in the like hippie parent community, where we don't want screen based toys, but we do want tech based toys. And this idea of like, what's the tech without the screen has come up a lot in like parent conversation. And I like that question. Is like, what's the tech without the screen? What is that actually?
yeah,
You know?
yeah. I was at a talk once, and the person giving the conversation was telling us a story about how they were in a park with, and their friend, their colleague, had a small child in the pram, and the entire time that the two adults are speaking, the child is going like this, and they can't figure out what kind of gestures that she's making, and they finally kind of go to the child's perspective, because it also was interesting is it required them to go actually to a different perspective so they could see these hand gestures. And once they did it, they realized that the child was trying to zoom the tree, just had the real tree. And I thought that was the most, of course, at the time, the entire discourse was like, oh no, technology is changing,
Yeah.
our children, and this is terrible. It's too many screens. And I just remember feeling at that time. So thanks for making me feel validated now. Thank you. Because I remember feeling at that time that I think we've moved into a different space
Yeah.
where the interface is just, who knows what it is,
Yeah.
but it just isn't what it was.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
the fact that you still have and I think the part that I felt uncomfortable in that moment was we were so focused in the room on the fact that this innocent being was trying to interact with a technology that we sort of talked over the fact that you still had a young child who was fascinated by that tree, so much so that they needed to get closer.
Exactly.
And it couldn't have been more symbolic because the child is trapped in the pram, so it can't even get close. It's actually the parents that's keeping the child, not the
Totally.
screen. Right.
Totally.
But the screen is like this stand-in as a barrier, and I think that's why I really appreciate the way that you help us move these barriers to different places. And I feel like the first question I asked about how you're putting these pieces together, I feel like this getting answered through that, right? And that maybe that is it.
Yeah.
I'm looking at our background now and this high that, you have to even like all these types of perspectives, dipping down, going under, going in, going on top, you know.
Yeah, totally.
And I just really enjoy, I guess, this sort of almost gamification of this problem at hand.
Yeah, totally, totally. It's like, what are all the different ways we can feel this physically? And
We can
then,
feel it.
yeah,
Yeah.
just feel it.
Just feel it. Yeah, yeah. And how difficult it is to just feel it without expectation,
Yeah, totally,
right?
absolutely. I
And the
think,
amount, yeah.
yeah, no, I feel like actually sometimes I think my titles get so long because I'm waiting for it to be long enough that things don't need to have a direct meaning, that they can
Mhm.
just feel like it's, yeah. I guess I'm quite into atmosphere.
Which I, which I guess that connection to abstraction, I mean, that is it.
Yeah, it's there. It's totally there. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's so difficult to explain abstraction because I feel like, not to sort of diverge for a second, but, I feel like within an art historical context or with art, we've been conditioned for reasons, right? There are historical reasons for this, mostly colonial types of reasons, but
Yeah.
we've been conditioned to sort of not only assign, beauty, taste, form, even the sublime to certain types of mediums and artworks, but we've also been conditioned to feel a sense of shame if we don't have a connection to it
Exactly.
or feel that we're not intelligent enough or that we're not, something is lacking and wrong. And then you have a wave of art of abstraction, which makes this even worse, right? There's not, to walk into a museum space and to see a painting that's larger than any room you've ever been in. And it's just the color blue with a purple dot. And the title of that painting is, Shipwreck in 1822. You completely lose this sort of language and perception.
Yeah.
And I know abstraction comes in many different forms, but it seems like what you're suggesting in a way is that discomfort with not knowing is what makes it beautiful, right? Is what makes it.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. And it's like it takes, I think the thing that frustrates me maybe about abstraction, especially in the museum context, is that it takes a lot of feeling quite secure to be able to say you don't know and to feel comfortable being I can't access this, but I want to access this, you know? So it's almost always easier to just say, I don't know, my kid could do that. Let's move on, you know? And I think to that then is like maybe also then creates a particular politic for my work, that it's like trying to find a way to short circuit the fact that sometimes you come into a space and you don't feel like you can access your subconscious mind, or you don't feel that you can just like get into this like faith-based spiral with me and be like, yeah, we're just gonna like talk through data right now. You know what I mean? Like it's not, I don't know, it requires a calmness and a self security that not everybody gets to have. And I sometimes think like poetry can do that labor quite quickly. That like by reading a poem, because people often, if they can read, can engage with the way that something feels, the pleasure of a poem. I think that pleasure then allows for a relaxation or something, and then we can get into it. But
Right,
it doesn't always work. You know, sometimes it
right,
works.
right. So is you it's something just sort of coming into my mind. I'm really curious of your perspective. For you, then, is poetry an equivalent to jazz? Or is
Yeah.
jazz an equivalent to a type of poetry? Or what is poetic for you? Because I feel like given our conversation, I feel like poetry isn't what I'm thinking poetry is.
No, poetry is definitely jazz. It's definitely Black classical music. It's definitely that. It's definitely that. That I don't know, overwhelming of feeling and sound, and uh, it's like undeniable or something. Like Love Supreme. Like when you hear that, it's just like, wow, this is unbelievable. And it's like you can be like, wow, this homie's trying to talk to God right now. Like you can hear that. And that kind of level of just like, I don't know, that attempt or something that happens so often in jazz is something that I think is also happening in poetry. Like
Mm,
poetics is about like, yeah, it is like kind of trying to manifest different forms of maybe commitment is the word, but maybe it's something else. Maybe it's more than that. It's like a kind of not just naming that one is alive, but also naming that there's um there's beauty in trying to connect with someone else. And it's like in Black Cox music and jazz, you're kind of that's all you're doing. It's just being like, I'm gonna connect with you right now, and like it or not, like
right? Like,
I'm gonna try.
right. I mean, then what role would improv play in that then?
I think improv then plays like actually a really crucial role, which is a kind of in the same way that it's like even wilder in the attempt because you're sort of saying like I'm I'm just gonna give it what I can right now, and that's that. And so improv is almost like a kind of improv is like I would say the most heightened form of that because also the failure is real and possible and happens all the time, So that's also really fascinating to me somehow. Like
Yeah,
that improv is higher stakes because it doesn't always work.
it
Like,
doesn't.
and that's good. Like it shouldn't always
Right.
work.
Yeah, and it almost exhausts itself in that exhaustion of not working. Yeah,
Exactly. Totally. Totally. And the like, it's like the improv, it's like they're like, okay, what about this? Ah, that doesn't work. Okay, what about that? Oh, okay, that doesn't work. It's like you just like keep going and going and going until something sounds good.
yeah, yeah. I mean that concept. I mean, I was so struck. I even put it in the acknowledgments of of my last book is that I think it's 91 Seal album, Human. Really obscure album. Is a dark moment for the singer. That was a dark moment. But dark moments can produce some beautiful albums.
Exactly.
But in this sort of its own acknowledgments, he just basically says, "This is all I have to give."
Yeah.
And it was so powerful to me to have someone just say, you know what, no matter what stage I'm on, no matter what platform I'm on, no matter what I've voiced, no matter what I've just produced, in the end, this is all I had to give.
Yeah.
And I've exhausted all of my creative possibilities. And but it felt so generative. It felt like this is just this moment. I'll take a quick rest. I'll be back,
Yeah.
or maybe not be back. We don't know, right? Just
Totally.
leaving it open. So it's very interesting to hear you speak this way, not just about your own work and the way you actually occupy this world as an artist, as as a scholar, as a thinker. There's so many ways I could describe you, but in all those ways, it seems like each moment you give us an opportunity to transcend even that label or that title. I feel like you're always inviting me to move with you and thinking about your relationship of invitation and inviting people to move with you. And I'm thinking, is it safe to then assume that you landing in April in Shanghai, is that the invitation for that to move with you? Or is this a stopping moment? Or is it just a recognition moment for the next? And I know you're saying you don't know, but I'm just trying to think about what you hope at least to get out of the process itself.
I think like I feel like my my hope to get out of the process is so much about the dialogical space. So I feel like the show itself kind of turned out to be about what does it mean to be alive in a way. And I think because I'm in Shanghai a lot because of the show, and I feel like every time I go, I'm having these really, I don't know, really good conversations with visitors and with the volunteers especially, and the questions around like how do we how do we not just make connection with one another, but how do we try and see one another in a way that's really open to change? And I was talking to one volunteer who was like, kind of like, yeah, the thing about being alive is that we're never stagnant. And when someone tries to make you stagnant, it makes you crazy. And I was like, exactly. That's yes, totally. Like perfect, perfectly said.
Right.
And this question around, I guess like some of like my arrival in Shanghai, kind of I think I actually have a bit of a sadness about it because I just really like to hear how people feel about living and being alive. And it feels like in each work there's a proposition to ask that question or to think through that question about like, so if you see a map and you can't read it, what do you do? Like, what do you do with that? Like, where do you go? How do you navigate it? And the answers are fascinating, you know? Some people are like, I won't navigate it. I refuse. Or like, I just see the beauty in the shape or the form. Or there's like anger of like, then it can't be a map. Like, then we can't call it this thing. It has to have a new name. It's like, well, what do we call it? You know, it's like these conversations feel really, I don't know, important to me as I keep pushing the practice. And so in some ways, it's almost like I hope I don't land. Like I hope I keep swimming in a way because I think I don't know. I've been really grateful to the visitors and viewers and volunteers of like really engaging with the work. And so I kind of, I don't know, very, very selfishly, I'm like, I don't, maybe I won't land. Maybe
Right.
I'll just stay swimming.
I wish I could go back in time and play with you as a kid. I bet you were so fun.
It was crazy. I don't
I
know.
bet you imagination and playtime were so incredibly fun. I can't imagine what a tree would be if we were playing together in this. Probably a rocket ship or something even more fantastic. I think even more fantastic than that. Hide and seek. Tell me,
Yeah, yeah.
what is this? We've talked about your other works.
It's
Talked
true.
about the show that's here. I even see we have a background. We can see the cowhide. Now we have something else.
This
What
is
is
like this work is like a total soup of like all my wild ideas coming together in one. So like X invited me to do the show, and I had been like not recovering, but I'd been thinking a lot about these sci-fi creatures that I had made up whose job it was to filter plastic out of the ocean. And basically, after they filter plastic out of the ocean, they just like don't have anything to do. Like they're kind of free. And
like the water
like,
bottle that was floating previously?
yeah, yeah. Like they didn't finish for my swim, but just like this is now my speculative space. And so these creatures, since they finished cleaning the ocean, are like, let's go to Shanghai and let's party. And their idea of partying is to play hide and seek. Because they're pretty relaxed. And so yeah, so that's what this game is basically, is these creatures playing hide and seek around the bund near where the museum is, and trying to catch one another. And they have these like really weird fancy like kind of shouting guns to catch each other. And yeah, that's what the piece is. But what it actually ended up become, because again, this is like me just being like, I think I just gotta make this thing and we'll just see what it looks like. What the piece ended up becoming is this like kind of like dark and hard to play thing where you're like looking for these creatures that have like no real gravitational pull, but at the same time can like move through space. And it kind of like was a jump into the absurd or something as a kind of foil for the show, which has a lot of seriousness inside of it. This was like a very much a play space and was just kind of like, well, what does that feel like to play hide and seek with these creatures, to be one of these creatures? And of course, like so much of my early work was interested in the fact that I was like looking at virtual reality and I'm like, I'm trans. And people kept saying like, oh, you can really become someone in VR. And it's like, you can't become anyone. Like
Right.
that, like, you can't become anyone. But when you play a game, you can kind of like, you can get really close to someone. Like, you can get kind of adjacent to someone. And I kind of felt like I wanted to be adjacent to these, like, creature things that I made. So, yeah.
Wow. I mean, this type of adjacency, when I, reflect on this moment that we're in, I think this is beyond the type of, post-algorithmic or even
Mm,
post-capitalist. We're entering into this moment where it's just a conflation of everything. Everything has reached a type of magnitude, or at least appears to be perceptually. I'm not actually convinced it actually is in
yeah.
reality, but it at most either appears to be or is felt as such. And that's enough for the human condition, even to be felt as such.
Yeah.
And and we have reached this sort of spread of exhaustion, this the exhaustion of our creative abilities, even our own manual labor, the exhaustion of trying to reconcile interpersonal relationships and social relationships, coming together more often, or being forced into situations of being together without understanding, without even a sort of balance of the times when we need to be alone,
Yeah.
less contemplation time, but more of giving that over to, other things outside of us to organize our types of lives. And, of course, this is no coincidence. We have very sophisticated technologies that have always been shaped around ideologies that were meant to sort of reduce our human experience, under very simple premises that they can make better decisions than us. They can work more than we, better than us. They can create art better than us. They can, all these types of otherings. And when we think about this scope, it's, in one sense, of course, we feel the intensity of this, but also feel this need, maybe, collectively to try to build new languages of release through that.
Yeah.
And the permission that, and going back to that word of permission, and not in the sense of dominance, right?
Mhm.
I give you permission to do so, but more so in psychosocially in the terms of invitation.
Yeah.
Because culturally, we're from two different geographical, not really that far geographically from each other, so we share, cultural type of ancestry,
Yeah.
and that idea of being given permission works very differently in African American context, because sometimes you need an elder to actually give you permission to see yourself as better than yourself.
Exactly.
So they will stand in to give you the courage and the reassurance when you somehow can't at
Yeah.
any given moment. And then, of course, that's how the communal relation happens, because it might be your turn to do that for someone next.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah.
And and then to extend that type of permission, I think, is the missed opportunity when we think about AI and large language models. And that permission has been in, I give you permission to not worry about this email. I give you permission to not worry about your inbox. I give you permission to, to turn the lights on in your house. And it's so superficial compared to the conditions of us as human beings. And what if it was more aspirational? What if it was a permission that gave us an allowability to actually, if we wanted to, get close to that plastic blob and follow it around or play with it, right? You can join the game. I mean, you're literally inviting us to join the game with these plastic blobs. And and I think in that sense, not even negotiating, actually building a different relationship with technology and data is what I really appreciate about our conversation and about you and our work, because I feel like what you're showing the world is that our relationship with technology is not the same, but is also not vastly different than our relationship with animals, our relationship with the land, our relationship with the sea, our relationship between, with our own cultures, with other cultures, with even these mundane objects like plastics. Like, these are all similar types of relationships. And if we stop treating them like strangers and begin to treat them like something else, then maybe we can have a different sense of humanity, with and in between them. So,
Yeah, totally. That's what I hope for. And thank you.
no, thank you. Thank you. I think that, I want to also just give you an opportunity, while we have a few moments left to reflect on the show more, or in thinking through the show, or thinking through data, or the algorithmic, or a contemporary moment. I just want to be able to offer another opportunity for you to speak to us about this. It's somewhat self-serving because I love hearing you speak. So I'm just going to put you on the spot one more time, to maybe share with us anything that you've experienced about this show, any reflections that you might have, or any sort of relationship between previous or even future work.
I think so I do critiques in every show that I do. Like every solo show I do a critique. Because I kind of think my mom is a certified accountant and she has to get recertified every 5 years. And I think that artists should also be sort of constantly pursuing their own recertification. And so in that process, I do my crits. And in this particular crit, I got a really interesting critique that was about the crossing work. And they just were like, okay, I believe you that you're pulling all this data. I believe you that this avatar looks like you. I believe you. But because I can't see where these things are coming from, it's making a black box and it's suffocating. And I was like, awesome. Like, it was like, that is exactly what I needed to hear, right? Because it's like, it's true, the crossing work is doing all sorts of stuff. But by not showing the full means of production, am I simply reifying the very thing I seek to critique? And it's like, yeah, maybe I am. And I do that with the cows sometimes. I subjugate them in the same way that I worry about like being subjugated. Like, and I wonder if maybe the next steps for my practice, as evidenced by that crit, are to see what happens if I'm like even more radically open. Like if I just like really pull things apart and show every layer of the making. And not just every layer of the making, but every layer of how the work is making itself. So yeah, so I don't know, that's been really on my mind with the show. And then of course this work with my family of showing the way that my family has moved through the Pacific or had like relationships in particular with Hawaii, and how like Black American identity can kind of sit in this in between zone of being like both the exploiter and exploited at the same time. And the kind of aspirational nature of my parents taking us on these amazing vacations in the same way, also being like, wait, but do we believe in this? Is this okay? Do we agree with this? And kind of going back over the family archive and wondering, like, not just what the motivations were. Like as I talked to my parents, they're like, "What? We had friends in Hawaii. We're going to Hawaii." Like it's fun. Like the kind of simplicity of that answer, and then at the same time, them also being like, "Yeah, but we recognize that that was definitely not okay for the Native Hawaiians. That like our arrival in that space was not okay." And so yeah, so I don't know. Trying to look at these complex family relations, I think is likely going to be more of my practice. Trying to feel like what's going on in my family as we go deeper and further back and the record starts to become more speculative and not clear. So yeah, so I don't know. I think I'm kind of trying to figure out, like, this show has shown me a lot about what it might mean to be transparent and the importance of that transparency, and then what comes from that. Like if you're willing to show yourself in various stages of life, what is someone willing to give back to you? And kind of finding that people are willing to give a lot, actually, like in really beautiful conversation and ways of thinking. So yeah, so I don't know. I think when I reflect on this show, I still remain kind of amazed that it happened and like flattered to be invited and so excited and confused by it. Um, and then, of course, the piece that we didn't talk about so much, but I feel like is also kind of high on my mind is the algae light. I'm thinking about like the different ways that we could construct our cities and spaces that we live within that is like um, maybe more exploitative of other creatures, but maybe has a symbiosis in mind or something. So it's like that light is low, you know? It's like we don't actually need our lights to be high. We need them to be low. We're not that, but for some reason we build these spaces that are like for giants or for sight that isn't actually necessarily ours. I'd be really curious to start making spaces that are like completely relational to the human and that are also completely harmonious with the other creatures that are trying to exist in these spaces, you know? So I don't know. I feel like as the show is coming to a close, I also feel incredibly open to like all these different possibilities that each of these works is opening up for my practice. It's incredibly exciting, to be honest. I'm stoked.
Well, I'm very grateful um, for you for sharing this with the world,
Well,
and for sharing
thank,
your process. I know these forums sometimes I know they can be, it's like putting a microscope, under your process, and everyone wants to know the mind of the artist, you know, and wants to experience, the artist's hand. And I think it's absolutely wonderful and actually special that you're able to do this and that you offer this for us and that you offer so many accessible ways for us to understand, your own place in being in this world, but also the how you help us open ways for us to understand our own place in being in this world. And if these imaginaries, I think not long ago, just seemed like pure speculation and fiction, and the way that you're able to bring a conversation together that shows us that actually this is closer to reality than we might think it is. I think for years to come, it's going to be looked back on as being a very, very key moment for us. So thank you so much for that.
thank you. Thank
And with
you.
this, I will conclude our conversation. Thanks again to the Rockbond Museum, Art Museum, for having us. I'm Ramon Amaro. This is Rindon Johnson, and I wanted to say goodbye to my friend. So.
Bye. Thank you.